Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, and I am thrilled to join you in this discussion addressing fair housing chances in New Jersey and around the country. I'm so New Jersey centric that just came out that way. I'm delighted to be joined by an amazing panel of experts and hardworking people who care so much about these issues and will share richly their experiences and their ideas. Is vital to full and meaningful participation in our society, but too many people lack a safe and stable place to call home. It is intrinsically linked to every other aspect of our lives, from the education of our children to the safety of our neighborhoods to the jobs we're able to find. When affordable housing is available in all communities rather than concentrated in undeserved regions, we ensure equal access to equal opportunity for all of our residents. This panel today focuses on the very ways to achieve that, and I am honored to be alongside these experts who can share how we can ensure greater access because it is impossible to lead a healthy life without safe and healthy housing. As a member of the New Jersey General Assembly, I led the fight for A500, legislation that built the fair housing framework that too often left out people of color. We need to create more opportunities for racial, economic, and social integration. This is a moment here where we need to be aligned with one another and recognizing that the government has a responsibility in our lives to encourage housing ownership. We also need to elect people to do the things that are needed to be done and to create an equal opportunity for people who look like us. Like this forum, we need people to be talking in spaces that we're not sometimes attending because there's still a lot that we have to address. And I am proud to be alongside my colleagues, Representative Nanette Barragan and Representative Cori Bush in the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness. And I look forward to continuing to address the resources and the policy opportunities that address secure housing and services for the nation's 580,000 individuals who experience homelessness in the United States. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to a video by Rep. Nanette Barragan and extend the dialogue on the best way to solve these crises.
Good afternoon. It's great to join you today to commemorate New Jersey's Fair Chance at Housing Act and to co-host this conversation with my colleagues, Representative Watson Coleman, a strong voice in Congress for criminal justice reform, and Representative Bush, one of our leaders in Congress on housing, even camping out on the steps of the Capitol building to have the voices of the unhoused heard. This Fair Housing Month, we recognize the progress made in New Jersey. We also must take this opportunity to recommit ourselves to advance justice and equity for all Americans. Today's discussion with housing experts from across the country will discuss the obstacles to housing that formerly incarcerated individuals face and potential solutions to make sure they have access to safe and stable housing. It's important that we identify the barriers to housing that the formerly incarcerated face so that we can do all we can to reduce and take down these barriers. In Los Angeles County, which includes my congressional district, 70% of people experiencing homelessness are involved in the justice system at some point in their lifetime. This is especially true for people of color who are disproportionately impacted by homelessness and incarceration. That's why I'm thankful to organizations like Optics and their executive director, Veronica Lewis, who has spearheaded efforts in my district and the surrounding areas to improve access to homeless services with the focus on reentry services and racial equity. Through her work as chair of the Reimagine LA Advisory Committee, she led the process to develop a transformative spending plan that resulted in $187 million in county funding to address the impacts of racial inequities in the criminal justice system. She's also the chair of the steering committee for the Los Angeles Regional Reentry Partnership Housing Committee. Today, we look forward to Veronica's valuable input and the panel's discussion. Together, we can create solutions at the federal level to reduce barriers to housing for people impacted by the justice system and protect them from discrimination. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to share with you that Congresswoman Bush has asked us that to pass along that she is very sorry that she's not able to attend today's discussion, but obviously this is one of her priorities and she'll continue to work hard in this space. I now have the pleasure of introducing Demetria McCain, who serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She assists the HUD's effort to eliminate housing discrimination, promote economic opportunity, and achieve diverse, inclusive communities. And she has the pleasure of working with my great friend, the Secretary, Marcia Fudge. Demetria?
Thank you so much, Representative. Well, first, I want to commend you and all of you who organized this for addressing fair chances in housing. This convening is so important. And as you all probably know, it's Fair Housing Month, as was mentioned. And Fair Housing Month is when we highlight the relevance, the current relevance of the Fair Housing Act and recognize the prohibitions against race, national origin, color, religion, sex, including gender identity and sexual orientation, familial status, and disability as the bases for housing discrimination. No housing discrimination should be based on these protected classes. So in addition, it's also Second Chance Month. And as noted by President Biden's proclamation last year, quote, when we reaffirm the importance of helping people who were formerly incarcerated re-enter society, that is what Second Chance Month is all about, is focusing on that. And not just for 1 month. Our leader here at HUD, the Secretary Marcia L. Fudge, recognizes that individuals with criminal histories too often face daunting and unnecessary barriers to obtaining housing, to maintaining housing, and that includes public housing, HUD-assisted housing, and HUD-insured housing, which are often the only types of housing they can afford. Now, she takes health and safety of our communities very seriously. And at HUD, we found that too often, criminal histories are used to screen out or evict individuals who pose no actual threat to the health and safety of their neighbors, which makes communities less safe because providing returning citizens with housing helps them reintegrate and make themselves less likely to offend. We also here at HUD acknowledge the fact that persons who have been involved with the justice system are disproportionately persons who are Black, brown, or live with a disability. That is why Secretary Fudge, as part of our ongoing effort to make HUD programs more equitable, issued a memorandum directing all relevant HUD program offices to identify all existing HUD regulations, guidance documents, and other policies and sub-regulatory documents, including model leases and other agreements, that may pose barriers to housing for persons with criminal histories or their families. And actually, she wants us to propose updates and amendments that are consistent with her directive to make our programs as inclusive as possible. Now, this is an all hands on deck effort here at HUD, which we intend to bear fruit in the very near term. So keep a lookout for that. And in fact, my very office, actually, we have a regulatory agenda. And on our regulatory agenda is a proposed rule, which will be entitled Removing Criminal Conviction Restrictions for Testers in FIP-funded Testing Programs. And additionally, last year, I issued a memorandum to our HUD staff, to our FHO staff, to our Fair Housing Initiative programs, which are FHO grantees, and to Fair Housing Assistant programs, which are local and state agencies to whom we refer housing cases. And that memorandum was entitled Implementation of our Office of General Counsel's guidance on application of Fair Housing Act standards to the use of criminal records by providers of housing and real estate related transactions. It highlights the importance of applying the principles of our Office of General Counsel's 2016 guidance on the application of Fair Housing Act standards to the use of criminal records by providers of housing and housing related transactions. And it also highlights the need for FHEO investigators and fair housing partners to be aware of the ways in which criminal background screening policies and practices can violate the Fair Housing Act. And that memo also provides tips for conducting investigations relating to criminal background screening. And it sets out some best practices for our FIP and FAP partners, for their staffs, so that we can suggest some things for them to suggest to housing providers who may be concerned about potential liability related to the use of criminal background screening information on applicants or on tenants. And so again, I applaud you all for focusing on this hugely important topic, and I wish you a very, very productive afternoon. Thank you so much, Representative, and thank you others.
So much. I want you to know that your words were music to our ears. And now, so that we can start this very rich discussion that's going to take place, I'd like to throw it over to Brielle Bryan, who is our moderator today. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. Brielle and our panelists will get a chance to introduce themselves. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be able to be part of this conversation. As the representative just noted, I'm an assistant professor of sociology, and what I study is primarily consequences of criminal justice system contact for individuals in the United States. A lot of what I do is look specifically at housing-related outcomes, and including current work that I'm doing, an experimental study looking at the extent of discrimination that people with felony convictions face in different housing markets across the country, and how that varies by their race, their gender, their parent status, and a number of other things. So I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation today, and I'm very eager to hear what the various panelists have to say on this topic. First off, I want to give everybody on the panel a chance to introduce themselves and their organization before we move into talking about this question in greater depth.
Hi, my name is Peter Hepburn. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University, Newark. I'm also the associate director of the eviction lab at Princeton University.
Hey everyone, my name is Lee Camp. I'm an attorney in St. Louis, Missouri. I work with an organization called Arch City Defenders. We're a holistic nonprofit legal civil rights organization, and as a part of our work, we do housing work in a variety of areas, and really looking forward to the discussion today.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Veronica Lewis, as you heard, I oversee an organization called HOPICS, Homeless Outreach Program Integrated Care System, which is the division of special service for groups. We serve Los Angeles County and are one of the largest homeless and housing providers. We're also a reentry provider to people returning home from incarceration, as well as a behavioral health provider. So I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of, hopefully, will be transformative change to change some of our federal policies. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adam Gordon with Fair Share Housing Center in New Jersey, and honored to be part of this conversation. We've worked very closely with the Congresswoman on many of the initiatives she mentioned, and we worked to pass the first statewide Fair Chance in Housing Act, which limits for all housing providers the ability to screen on the basis of criminal background in New Jersey in 2021, and really looking forward to this conversation.
Wonderful. So first, I would like to get a lay of the land from everybody who's involved in the panel and learn a bit about what you've seen in your work with regard to the barriers that individuals with criminal histories face. One thing I do want to note that I forgot to mention in my intro is that much of the focus in this conversation thus far and across the country when discussions of fair chance housing come up has been on the formerly incarcerated. But my own sort of personal pedestal that I'll step up on, I'd like to note that There are twice as many people in the US who have felony convictions and no history of incarceration. And they are similarly subject to these criminal background checks and a lot of barriers. So what I'd love to hear is from each member of our panel, what barriers you've seen in your own work, recognizing that everybody's coming from slightly different areas in terms of what the focus of your organization is. But at least to get us started in terms of what has emerged from the perspective of the work that your organization engages in with regard to individuals who have criminal histories and their attempts to establish and maintain stable housing. Perhaps Veronica, you'd like to start us off, as I know that, yeah, you are very much on the ground in this area.
Thank you. Yeah, obviously, besides the well-known housing discrimination, regardless of housing law, some of the other things we see is when people are returning home, if they do have a family and support system that would allow them to return home, sometimes those households are receiving subsidies funded through HUD, and a lot of the local housing authorities still have restrictions so that people with felonies cannot return home or cannot be a person that lives within a unit where there's a housing subsidy. And so that alone creates a dynamic if you do have a loving and supportive network to return home to, but you can't because obviously you will risk their housing stability. In addition to that, naturally, a lot of the people we're talking about are employable. They're looking to increase their income. And so besides the housing discrimination, obviously discrimination in employment, even in communities where Ban the Box and other initiatives have taken place, a lot of employers are still screening out candidates that have backgrounds. And obviously that means you can't increase your income. The other thing I'll say is that, you know, a lot of the local in LA County in particular, there are resources that are locally generated now that remove the restrictions for people with any type of felony. But across the country, that's still not the case. Even non-federal dollars, a lot of times still have restrictions for people to access them for time-limited subsidies or short-term subsidies. And then lastly, you know, the unnecessary, non-data driven exclusions for certain types of offenses that preclude people that may need a long-term subsidy from accessing a long-term subsidy, allows a lot of people to be left out, in particular those who are not employable, who may be disabled and may not be able to sustain their own rent. And so lots of work to do here. Thank you for starting with me.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Lee, I'm wondering if perhaps you would like to step in next, given that you are similarly on the ground, but coming at this from more of a legal perspective.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to, and I'm no proxy at all for Congresswoman Cori Bush, who represents us here in St. Louis. I really like the posture of this question, asking about current barriers to accessing housing, because I think we do, you know, applaud the work that has been done to really change the way that housing access is in today's modern terms. But I think of a story just a year ago. I received a call from a local reporter about an individual who had a felony conviction for drug possession, who was not able to access private housing because of a 100-year ban on any felony conviction for any applicant that was trying to access this housing. And I think it's just stark to think in today's society, there's a 100-year ban. We can't even live through that type of ban to ever access that housing. So it is really a current issue. I would echo the sentiment before that while there are protections on the federal level, that we still see these issues pop up, particularly when it comes to certain types of felonies that we have to navigate. And as someone on the ground representing families still, I still represent individuals that are going through evictions or trying to access housing and bringing fair housing claims. This is a common issue for us. It's one that we receive calls on every week for individuals in the St. Louis community looking to access some sort of legal advocacy because they've run out of different options of trying to advocate for themselves and overcome these barriers. So it really is, you know, it's had a historic impact in our community for sure, but it's something that's happening every day and something that we are keenly aware of and have to exist simply to serve our community members that really need this help here in St. Louis.
Thank you so much, Lee. Adam, I know that you are in a unique position and can tell us a bit about how things look on the other side of legislation focused specifically on this. So I'll let you speak a little bit to that situation for anybody who's not familiar, and then I would love to hear your response in terms of even with that legislation in place, what barriers you're seeing.
Sure. Thanks, Brielle. So yeah, for people who don't know about the Fair Chance in Housing Act in New Jersey, it's the first statewide legislation that limits criminal background screening and has a strong enforcement mechanism through our Division on Civil Rights, which is part of our Attorney General's office. And it basically has a tiered system of lookbacks, so that depending on the severity of the charge, there's a certain number of years beyond which that record cannot be considered, and also the record can only be considered after a conditional offer is made. So you have to do an initial review of the application. There is then a conditional offer. You can then run a criminal background check, but you can only consider convictions with a certain number of look-back years. None of them are 100-year look-backs. It's a pretty crazy example, although I'm not surprised by it based on what we're seeing historically here. And then also you have to give people an opportunity to offer mitigating evidence to show why they should be accepted into housing through an individualized assessment. And I really give a lot of kudos to our Attorney General's office for really bringing strong enforcement actions. They have really gone after a number of landlords who've been violating this and sent a pretty strong message that, you know, this is the law in New Jersey and that it will not be tolerated to be doing what has been business as usual historically in New Jersey and elsewhere, and that there's potential consequences for it. They've also done a lot of really good community education for impacted people to know their rights, and also done a lot of really good trainings for landlords. And so it really has started to change things significantly. Before that, we were really seeing very similar conditions to what everybody else has been discussing. I mean, we were seeing people denied, I mean, to give one example, denied access to public housing in Asbury Park, a gentrifying community, for a 17-year-old drug conviction, and with nothing since then. And so, you know, I do think that what that created was really a dual housing market where people were forced into homelessness or really very high rent, you know, living in motels, those kinds of informal housing situations. And we're starting to see that change. There's still a lot more work to do. And I think what Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary McCain said is really important, because right now in New Jersey, you actually have more rights with a private landlord than you do with a public housing authority. So really looking forward to those changes that Secretary Fudge has been talking about and hoping that they come soon.
Thank you so much. Peter, I know that this last point is something that that you've raised previously, and so I would love to allow you the chance to speak on this if you'd like to weigh in.
Sure. Just to build on what Adam was saying, this opportunity to offer new evidence and to challenge tenant screenings is just so important and such a kind of a critical aspect of the Fair Chance in Housing Act that would be great to be able to see that rolled out more broadly and to apply not just to convictions, but also to evictions. I mean, those are the two big red flags that landlords are looking for when they screen their tenants. And in a tight rental market where their vacancy rates are low, either of those red flags is going to be a disqualifying factor for a lot of renters. Just because you had an eviction against you 8 years ago, 12 years ago, that's still there on your record, that doesn't mean that you aren't going to be able to pay rent moving forward. And that shouldn't be keeping you out of housing.
Thank you, Peter. And I can tell you that I'm across the country, I'm seeing the same thing in my own research, that as soon as somebody mentions a felony conviction, if they get a response at all, very, very frequently, the first question is, what was the conviction for? The second one is, do you have any evictions on your record? So especially for people with that sort of double layered, those two strikes against them, it's an incredible amount of challenges they face. One thing that I would love to hear from everybody about is if you see particular types of barriers or things that we should keep in mind in your particular region of the country as we think about how to move forward with fair housing and in particular think about what is the best approach from a federal perspective. Obviously, every housing market is different, particularly every rental housing market, in terms of the extent to which public housing is available or is waitlisted, what the structure of ownership looks like for private rental housing. And so for those of you who are from different parts of the country, as everyone is, if you could speak a little bit about what particularities you think are important to keep in mind for your region, and how we might bear that in mind when taking a step back to think about broader policies, that would be wonderful. At this point, I will see if anybody wants to pop a hand up or step forward first on this question.
Yeah, I'll start us. And you mentioned some of these. I have to say, obviously, because I'm from Los Angeles, that the rental market is ridiculously high, right? And the rent amounts are outpacing the incomes. And one of the other things that have happened that I don't think is unique to LA per se, but one of the things, because we have had such an infusion, obviously from some federal dollars, but state and local dollars, of these time limited subsidy type programs, and multiple entities have been doing them, and in some cases inadvertently, multiple competitors trying to get the same units for our participants have driven up the rents, I have to say. And so there's an effort right now. And, obviously on the HUD side, we have the criteria related to vouchers, but that is a phenomenon that I think we're actively trying to address. Obviously, also, this is not necessarily unique to LA, but I think it's important to say, right, I have to talk about the equity piece here. And I know we're going to have a question specifically later, but, in LA County, Black people are overrepresented in homelessness, and the other population is Native Americans, but overwhelmingly 40% of the homeless population and 10% of the general population, obviously overrepresented in the carceral system. And those things collide in many different ways. And there are not a lot of programs specifically that address criminogenic needs, that really focus on trying to make sure that we provide all of the supports that we know are needed for people to come back home and stay in the community. And so I think the main thing I would say, is the lack of direct servicing for people returning home. And then, I think the other thing, we're kind of at a turning point in LA. There are some cities in LA County that are starting to recriminalize homelessness, which then again increases the amount of recidivism, right? For people literally being charged and thrown in jail and prison because they have nowhere to go. And so that unfortunately is becoming a fight, a battle that we're in right now that further moves people back in and out of the cycle of incarceration. And so there's lots more I can say, but I'll pause there for now.
Thank you, Veronica. Perhaps Lee, would you like to follow up next and tell us if there are things we should know about St. Louis?
Yeah, sure. I hope I'm not too outside of the box here when I address the politics issue at play in a place like St. Louis. I think it's no surprise to a lot of people right now that in the quote unquote red states that have blue cities, political ideologies are fairly polarized at this point. And so the way we see that play out in the housing space at times is, as there are local wins, we see this in St. Louis, we see it in Kansas City, organizing and policy change that's impacted at the local or municipal level, oftentimes is preempted by our state legislature, who doesn't have an appetite to look at creative housing policies and ways to make housing more equitable throughout the state. And so really to the second prong, how does this impact federal housing policy? Well, it oftentimes becomes the only protection that I use when I advocate for individuals, or that those that live in our community have. We fill the gap of a lot of what our clients and our community members here in St. Louis experience day to day by looking to federal policy that does seem to have an appetite. I mean, this whole panel is happening for a reason, that we are talking about this at the federal level in a way that we haven't historically. And that's so exciting for someone like me that, I can go to our city councils, and we actively have a progressive city legislature right now who's looking to do things like ban the box in housing, but still have that fear that those things could be preempted by our state government. So we really rely on federal law, federal partners to promulgate new policies that serve our community. And again, happy to have an opportunity to share how important that is today to eradicate these barriers here.
Thank you so much, Lee. Let's see, Veronica, I see that you have something you'd like to add. So Adam, if you're okay with holding off one moment, I'd love to let Veronica weigh in.
Yeah, one more thing I want to add. And so obviously there needs to be a lot of work done to address the discrimination policies, right? Especially again, that are not data informed. But one of the things that we're doing to try to address the barrier is really looking at, part of the main issue is the screening, right? Obviously people need to be able to afford the rent, but part of it is people being screened out. And so part of what we're looking at right now is different types of unit acquisition strategies that allow us, our systems, local governments, to capture buildings or blocks of units that are that would traditionally otherwise be fair market, and do what's being called master or primary leasing, right? Where we then control who comes inside. In terms of housing policy, and we've had some movement on that. My own organization has almost 100 units that we've done that with, right? And that allows us to capture the units and move people in without all those barriers. But part of the challenge, especially as we start to talk about being able to utilize federally funded housing subsidies, is that the federal policy doesn't necessarily allow for us to serve in that capacity to receive long-term subsidies. And so I think that part of what needs to happen as we get creative, while we work towards improving the policy and putting more reinforcement, as one of my fellow panelists talked about, right, to hold landlords accountable, et cetera, is that in the meantime, if we're coming up with these creative ways to capture units and more quickly house all populations, in particular the folks returning home, we need the federal policy to come alongside us and adjust, right, and come up to where we are in 2023 to allow us to do those types of things without and be able to access the federal resources to do it. So I just wanted to lift it up because I think it's really important and a really critical strategy to at least get folks housed while we work towards the policy pieces.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Adam, would you like to add to this question of sort of thinking about particular things worthy of knowing about in your region, and how we should try to figure out how to incorporate this sort of information as we build federal policy?
Yeah, no, thanks, Brielle. Just very briefly, I think it's connecting what Veronica said with what Lee said. I mean, I think for a different reason, our region's more like California, and our rents are out of control, and just the just really crazy housing supply issues. And I think that for that reason, and really it's linked to what Veronica was saying, like the federal rules are really important because there's just not, when you get down to the levels of income for people in public housing and assisted housing, there's just not a lot of other resources besides the HUD resources to serve and a lot of those families. And so even though we have the Fair Chance in Housing Act, and even though we have really robust fair housing laws overall, because we have, like California, such an out of control housing market, what HUD does is really important, I think, for a different reason from the reasons that Lee's talking about. And so I think one lesson might be, even though our regions are very different, HUD's role in this and the kinds of things that are coming out of Secretary Fudge's directive to address this are going to be really important for a whole bunch of different regions of the country that for different reasons.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So one thing, if it's okay for me to go a little bit out of order on these questions, the issue of homelessness has come up a lot, in particular the links between incarceration and homelessness. And I know all of you have experience in this area, but slightly different perspectives. So I would love to get to talk about that particular question in a little bit more depth right now. Veronica, I don't know if you want to take the first swing at this question as well, if you're up for it, especially since homelessness sounds like a big core of what you do and what you focus on.
Sure. Just, you're asking the link between incarceration and homelessness, essentially?
Yeah, let's delve into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, again, when we look at the numbers, right, in terms of the carceral system, housing instability, which is different in some cases than homelessness, actual homelessness, health, education, employment, literally many of the groups that we're talking about, as we look at it from an equity lens, are either overrepresented or have desperate outcomes, right, in one of those areas. And so all those things are interrelated. And, I think that there's a couple of different things that are happening. One, if you are returning home and you have no safe place to live, for any of us, any type of barriers that we have to overcome or any type of challenges in our lives that we have to work out, the first place we go to is our place of peace, right? And a sanctuary to kind of think through, cry it out, or whatever our response is to whatever life is throwing at us. The majority of us have a place to go, right? At least to get away from whatever it is and have peace. If you don't even have that, most of the time you can't even start to get to all the other things it's going to take when you've just got home, right? And in many cases in California, a lot of the people that have thought they would never get out of prison because of a lot of our justice realignment stuff are now finding themselves back in the community after 15, 20, 30, 40 years. Their social networks are gone. They never thought they were going to get out. And literally, you can't even start to think about how to put all the pieces together if you don't know where you're going to lay your head at night. And so I think that we don't have sufficient systems to receive people returning home. We don't have sufficient pre-release activities. And I mean like meaningful pre-release before you're released. We are clear about where you're going. And the places that people do have to go, in some places they're still called, in some communities they're still called halfway houses, and other communities, you know, they found different names. But usually they're so restrictive that you still can't even get on your feet. And so we have an abundant amount of people returning home who have nowhere to go, and we don't have sufficient infrastructure to have them have a stopping place that really is person-centered, and then obviously be connected to a throughput to actually permanently house them. The second thing I'll say is that I'll say again, for people who can return home to their families and communities, in many cases, those families are low income and their housing will become at risk if those people return home. And so I think we need to really look at the cycles we're creating by having some of these policies. And I understand some of the things that have happened, right? Some of the things that led to some of these policies to try to protect against whatever behaviors we're trying to protect against. But we are literally creating a dynamic where people who have served their time for whatever they've been convicted of are returning home and have no assistance, have no real help, and they're discriminated against. And they still may be over policed in the community and so I think that when we talk about reentry, when we talk about people returning home, homelessness, houselessness, and housing resources has to be a part of it. Separately, also, when we talk about homelessness, in many communities, you literally still can just be picked up and put in jail because you're living outdoors. And we need to look at the criminalization of homelessness, and not only literally just because you're sleeping on the street, but a lot of the other low offense, nuisance type activities that are associated with not having shelter and having to live outside and outdoors, and those things ended up with people cycling in and out. And then not everybody that's returning home and not everybody that's homeless obviously is addicted to drugs or alcohol, but obviously there are a fraction of people that are cycling in and out of prison and out of homelessness because of addiction. And there's not necessarily across our country an appropriate response, right, to provide the community-based supports those folks may need, as opposed to throwing them in and out of jail. And obviously many of you know, very embarrassingly, in LA County, our Men's Central Jail and Twin Towers house the highest number of people experiencing mental health, which is not an appropriate place. And so I think that when we talk about it, we have to look at all the different intersection points related to housing and affordable housing and the policies related to that, subsidies, rental subsidies, whether they're short-term or long-term, behavioral health, primary health, and obviously the types of policies and laws and ordinances that are allowing us to put people in prison and jail just because they literally have nowhere to go.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I so appreciate you bringing up how interconnected these issues are. We know that, as you noted, that being homeless or unstably housed greatly increases individuals' risk of rearrest and reincarceration, likelihood that they may get a technical violation if on probation or parole. And then there's a fundamental issue that if you do not have a stable address, it's often very hard to register for benefit programs, get your license back, and so on. So thank you so much, Veronica. Let's see, Adam, or I'm sorry, Lee. Lee is who I wanted to hear from next. Lee, would you mind speaking to this question?
Sure, I'll do my best, but Veronica has pretty much summed this up perfectly. Ironically, this looks, compared to the last question, this does look almost the exact same in St. Louis. These points of kind of getting trapped in the system are absolutely here. In fact, in the state of Missouri, not just here locally, throughout the state now, it is a literal crime to camp out on state-owned land or public property, and cities are compelled to enforce this law or face a lawsuit from our Attorney General if we don't deal with this. And it's ironic because, as we've talked about for a variety of factors, these things stack on top of one another. I think Adam was the one that mentioned the kind of dual housing market or secondary housing market. When you're re-entering the access, once access becomes limited to that market, no one wants to acknowledge the reality that generally the other option is unsheltered homelessness, or maybe it's some sort of sheltered homelessness that does put others at a threat of eviction at that point, or the loss of their housing of some sort. So it really, these problems just build on one another as we continue to make additional barriers, even for those that are houseless at this point. And then I think as we see behaviors like homelessness be criminalized throughout the country, this is not unique to Missouri at all. There's pattern legislation passing in state houses throughout the country. As we see these laws passed, that only increases the opportunity for you to, one, come into contact with a police officer or someone in the criminal legal system, and then two, be subject to any sort of like search and seizure action that can lead to felony charges and lead to you being incarcerated, even pre-trial at that point. That can lead to the loss of your housing, or if you're unhoused at that point, again, just create an additional barrier to even get into a secondary housing market. So it truly becomes insurmountable for so many people. And as someone who is recently, as recent as a month ago, walked around homeless encampments here and met with people, generally I get tons of questions about what they can do to access housing with felonies on their records. It's an inextricable link that we have not figured out how to unwind as a society yet.
Thank you so much, Lee. So next up, one thing I'd like to speak about in brief is the position of Black women with regard to these issues that we've brought up and the housing crisis in general. So I'm not sure if anybody would like to take the floor first on this question, but I do want us to think briefly about how not just this criminal background history, but also race and gender overlap as we try to figure out what the right approach is moving forward. Any takers on the first word on this?
I'll start. I thought I saw one of my fellow panelists wanted to say something about this. That's why I was pausing. Did you want to? Okay. So I'll say this, there are several studies that show that Black women, in particular, Black women that are single mothers, are more likely, right, to be evicted than any other population. And I think that there's a couple of things that come to mind for me when I think about this. Again, the comments I made related to the overrepresentation or desperate outcomes, multiply that by a few numbers as it relates specifically to Black women. And I think that, what we've seen in particular for parenting mothers, we don't have systems of care set up, right, that really support their return and their release. And I think that some of the other nuances as it relates to just the experience of being a woman incarcerated, in some communities, they can't even get feminine hygiene related products, right? Whether it's just some of the things that we hear about what's happening and how people are treated while they're incarcerated across our country are just really, really disturbing. And so carry that forward to very minimal, with the exception of a lot of the grassroots organizations that have risen up from women who experience these traumas, right, and created on their own. But we don't have at scale a system that really supports women returning home, in particular, again, parenting women. So I'm going to talk about the mothers a little bit, because there are so many horror stories of women returning home, and obviously whether they have a family member that's been fostering their child or whatnot, the pathway to get on their own feet, because there's an absence of a scaled up system to help them increase their income, get safe and stable housing in a community that's safe for them and their family, and do all these other things so that they can put themselves in a position to parent their children and have them in the same household. They basically don't exist. The other thing is that, unfortunately, a lot of women, if they can access some type of public benefit initially, at least until they can increase their income, will have to be relying on the public benefit. But the public benefit, in many cases, the more children, if your children are in your custody, then you get the public benefit. So there's this vicious cycle with some women who are trying to get on their feet, right, to be able to then parent their children again and be in the same household with them. They can't even get on their feet because many of the benefits are tied to families with children in them. And so there's some things that I've started to see happen in communities. There's a pilot in LA County where for parents whose children have been removed from the home, right, we can work with them and pay their rental assistance and get them housed, and then they can reunite with their children within a couple of weeks. But that's on a very small scale. The other thing I'll say, just, overall, in addition to all the things we talked about that folks returning home face, in particular people of color, as it relates to discrimination, you add on the gender piece of it and some of the inequities that women in general face, right? And then you put some melanin on it. And quite frankly, some people have said Black women are the most disrespected group of people in our country. And whether or not you believe that or not, I'm a Black woman, and I know I've never been incarcerated. But I even at the tables I sit at experience some things that people will never understand, that don't look like me, right? That are not my gender. And so you add that experience that many Black women have in general on top of somebody that's considered a felon, right? Somebody that's considered, don't let addiction be attached to whatever their life challenges have been, like, and the way that they're treated, or the way that they're ignored, or the way that they're overlooked is just exponentially worse. And so all those compounding inequities and disparate impacts to Black women in general is just multiplied even more for people coming home that have this tag on their back of having a felony conviction.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Peter, would you like to step in on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Veronica's absolutely dead right here. When we look at the numbers nationwide, we know that Black women make up less than 10% of all renters in this country, but almost 40% of eviction filings are against Black women. I mean, that means that we're looking at more than 1 million eviction cases every year just targeted against Black women and their families. If you're coming out of prison and you're facing reentry and you have an eviction already on your record, it's going to be very, very difficult to find safe, stable, and affordable housing. And even if you don't have that, even if you're not reentering, even if you just have the eviction record, it's also just like finding housing is extraordinarily challenging. And that makes everything else that much harder. It makes looking after your kids that much harder. It means stable employment is going to be harder. Just everything that would help an individual and their family to make ends meet is going to be that much further out of reach.
Thank you so much. So next, I'd love to hear from Adam, if you've got something you can add on this point.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to note, I mean, one of the things we saw in the advocacy for the Fair Chance in Housing Act in New Jersey, which I would be remiss to mention, I mean, the Congresswoman, when she was a state legislator, was the person who originally came up with that bill in New Jersey. And it took a long time to get it passed. But, it's not only in red states that we have political resistance to advancing justice for people involved in the criminal justice system. And, we had a lot of contentious hearings, and we really saw a lot of the groups, the types of groups that Veronica was talking about, these groups of returning Black women really, come together and show up and give testimony at these hearings about really the impacts they were seeing, which is right what Veronica and Peter are saying, and that testimony and organization was really powerful. And I think one of the critical things to getting the Fair Chance in Housing Act passed in New Jersey. And I just think that it is really important to bring out those stories about the impacts on Black women and the overlapping impacts with evictions, with the impacts on custody of children. And because what we found is a lot of policymakers, including ones that were actually fairly sympathetic, didn't really know very much about that. And it really impacted how they thought about these issues.
Thank you so much. So we're short on time now. So in our last few moments, while we get to hear from each member of the panel, what I would love to hear from your perspective is how policymakers can be helpful in addressing these barriers to housing, and perhaps what the most important steps we might be able to take could be. Why don't we go from top to bottom? Lee, if you're willing to start us off, and then we'll go to Peter, Veronica, and Adam.
Sure, I'll make it quick here. When I think of policy making a lot, I think of it from the lens of the individuals I work with that do organizing and things like that in the housing space. And certainly we're always looking for creative partners, people that are looking to think outside the box in this area. But one thing that seems to fall somewhat by the wayside with policies is the educational component. There are certain federal protections that exist now for individuals that are reentering or have these felony convictions or criminal backgrounds, et cetera, that maybe they could opt into. I would always advise that any policy making solution should include a component that includes not only education to the individuals, but some sort of outreach. So this is an accessible, grievance program or way to grieve a decision that may be made against you, or just avenues for engagement with the general public and community members who are intimidated by having discussions like this. I'm a pretty community-centered person, and I really think it's important that we get into the community, center them, hear them, and find out solutions that work for those individuals, and that those policies are made in a way that are accessible and protect the individuals that promulgate them ultimately.
Thank you so much, Lee. Peter, would you like to step in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to barriers to housing, there are no shortages of challenges right now. There are a lot of problems out there. And I guess I would just urge policymakers to think creatively about what the low-hanging fruit is and how we can pursue changes that would be, most effective most quickly. And especially since we have Ms. McCain here today, I think there's a lot to be done in reforming screening practices in the private market, but also a lot to be done in HUD-supported properties. And I'd love to be able to see changes in the housing choice voucher system and in the public housing authorities that would improve tenant screenings practices and also eviction practices. One of the things that we see when we look at eviction data from around the country is that often the top evictor in any given city is going to be the public housing authority there. And often those public housing authorities are filing repeated cases against the same tenants at the same addresses. They're filing over very small amounts of unpaid rent, and they're making that tenancy that much more unstable, and they're making it more difficult to live there and more unstable for people who are already struggling with really low incomes. There's no reason that we need to be doing this. That's a choice, and one that we can also change.
Thank you so much, Peter. Veronica, please let us know, what can we do? What should we do to solve this?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. So one, I think that, as I referenced earlier, HUD over the last 10 years has removed some of the exclusionary content from their regulations related to what types of criminal convictions are allowed to access HUD issue vouchers, et cetera. But a lot of our PHAs still have higher barriers to access. And I it would be great if we could require PHAs across the state to minimize, right, and to be in line with HUD and not have all these other extra exclusionary items that leave more people out that need the long-term support. I think the other thing is that I didn't mention this, but one of the strategies obviously is housemates, right? Many of us have had roommates. You have your own room, lock and key, but you share common areas. In some cases, especially in LA, that's the only way people are going to be able to afford their rent. And some of the barriers we're finding is with HUD for some of the HUD subsidies is their policy doesn't really allow for us to determine what the rents are related to that type of living situation. And increasingly in LA, we're having to use that as an option. And so that's a like right now thing. And there's lots of talks with HUD, but we need that to be done right now to adjust your calculations of how rents are calculated for rooms for rent, if you will, because that's an affordable way for people to live. And then, at this point, quite frankly, we need some allocation of housing choice vouchers specifically for this population. To my knowledge, that has never been done. And the reality is, even in some of our homeless and housing systems, this population is somewhat overlooked. There's an awareness that a lot of the people that we're serving in homeless services systems are connected to the carceral system or criminal legal system, but there's no focus on them. And so at this point, I think that we do need an investment specifically for this population, obviously with some attachment of supportive services and other things, so that we can get some of these folks off the street that are very sick and that quickly need a place to live. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I'm so glad you pointed out the possibility of not just putting barriers on what landlords are allowed to do, but also finding ways to create programs that are specifically targeted towards making sure that we house this population. Adam, can you close us out on this question? Again, you come from this very interesting perspective of being in a state that has tried or it has already passed fair share housing. I'd love to hear from your perspective the extent to which that's working and what more we can and ought to do with regard to policymaking in this area.
Yeah, thanks, Brielle. I mean, I really agree with everything that my fellow panelists have said. I think it's really, really critical to focus on all these levers of HUD. There's other things that we work on that like local zoning, which is a huge barrier, and other housing issues that HUD, has some leverage on, but not as much as in this area. I think there's a lot, and Veronica in particular went over a lot of the key things that HUD can do to really push PHAs and also more directly really change things in a way that's going to have a really big impact. And so I think that's important. I certainly hope that other states will follow our model and pass fair chance in housing. There's obviously a number of cities that have done so. And I think the biggest lesson that we've learned is that strong enforcement is key. And this was frankly the biggest fight that we had during the legislative process. There were landlord groups that really wanted it to be kind of a slap on the wrist, not something in which, you had a real opportunity for prospective tenants to provide more context and have that rigorously examined in terms of, what the context is for their record. And I think, having that and having an agency, in our case, it's the part of the Attorney General's office that you can turn to really enforce that is really, really critical. And we'd love to work with anyone in other states or cities that are working to implement that, because I think that nuance is really important. And the last thing I'll say is going back to something Peter said earlier, I really think it's important to look at how all these different tenant screening practices intersect. I do think that one of the things that we don't have yet in New Jersey is looking at, past evictions, is really excessive use of credit checks, for example. And so, you can have protections now under our Fair Chance in Housing Act, but if someone has previously been evicted, that becomes the new basis to deny them housing. And so I think it's really important. And I'm glad HUD is looking at it. And I know CFPB and FTC are looking at it, looking intersectionally at all the different ways tenants are screened and used to deny housing, because, a lot of the things that are not directly about criminal background checks still disproportionately impact people who have been involved in the criminal justice system. And so I think it's really important to look at how all those issues fit together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists today for sharing your insights and your time with us. Thank you to our audience members for your attention and your patience and engagement with this. And thank you so much to Demetria McCain, as well as the representatives who spoke and who helped organize this event.